Kat and her sister Alex are having a drink at a bar. They are celebrating Kat being promoted again. The bartender is impressed and congratulates them. At this moment, a man at a bar named Richard hears their conversation, and decides to buy both girls a free drink. But Kat is being tough on him. Richard doesn't give up and continues flirting with her. 1 year later, Kat and Richard are now married. Richard congratulated his wife on another great promotion. She is one step closer from running for mayor. An unknown number calls Kat. She introduces herself as Susan. She tells Kat she didn't know Richard was married. They have seen each other for 6 months and now she is pregnant. Kat is shocked at hearing her husband has been having an affair. But Richard grabs the phone and talks Susan down. He tells Kat that Susan was Patience, who was convinced they were dating. Richard is a psychiatrist. Kat is having a hard time believing it as she never heard of this situation. But Richard reassures her this is the truth and calms her down. The next day, the couple moves into a new neighborhood, the same town Kat grew up in. They are welcomed by a neighbor named Vivian. She seems to have some interest in Richard, she even touches his hands. As soon as she leaves, Kat finds some sleeping medicine and Richard, who seems a little nervous, tells her it should be good for you. Days go by and Kat becomes friends with Vivian. One night, Richard steps out telling his wife it's a boys' night out. He borrows her car. Hours go by and Kat worries, as Richard is still not home, with no messages. She can't sleep so she decides to take those sleeping medicine and falls immediately to sleep. She wakes up the next day to Vivian who asks to borrow Richard to fix her kitchen sink. Kat reveals to her that her husband hasn't come back home yet. She then prepares herself and head to work at her new position. Richard calls her and says he did come back home. He adds that he even saw her in the morning before leaving earlier. Kat is confused, thinking how could she have forgotten that. Marcos Rivera interrupts her and welcomes to the job. He reminds her she left this town 1 week after prom. They were dating at that time. He is sad to learn she is married. He also reveals he is a detective now. Meanwhile, Vivian knocks on the door and Richard answers. She notices bruises on Richard's hand, but he tries to brush it off. She then asks for his help to fix her sink. Richard agrees to come over for a look. That night, Kat finally comes from home. Richard reassures her he came back last night. He blames her not remembering anything on the sleeping medicines she took. She then tells his wife that she took a swing at him, and shows her the bruises on his arms. Now Kat is extremely confused and sorry for that. The following day, Kat is at work and wants to spend her energy on drug prevention in the city. The mayor accepts her new ideas. Meanwhile, Richard comes back to Vivian's house to keep helping with the sink issues. Kat calls him and he ignores her. At this moment, Vivian receives a horrible call. Her friend was found dead due to overdose. She remembers her friend started dating a new guy but she never met him. Vivian doesn't believe her friend did it to herself. She wants to ask for an investigation believing someone is begin it. The next day, the couple comes out and when Kat tries to say hi to Vivian, she is cold. Richard informs her about the call she received about her friend. As soon as Kat leaves for work, Vivian comes to visit Richard. After work, Kat realizes Richard's location is on the other side of town, in Rustic Canyon. Marcos, who bumps into, finds it weird Richard is there. Kat tracks Richard and arrives at the location. She knocks on the door and it's Vivian who opens. Kat wants to knock what's going on, but Vivian gets mad and asks her to leave. The poor Kat is just trying to surprise her husband on their first-year marriage anniversary. She comes back home late and realizes Richard is there. He tells her he was at work the entire day, but Kat gets suspicious as she called his office and they told her he wasn't there. Later that night, Kat can't sleep like usual. Someone keeps texting Richard's phone. Kat checks and it's a text from someone saying, "I miss you Richard and wish you were here." The next day, Kat asks Marcos for his help as he is an investigator. When she comes home that night, Richard is sitting in the dark asking if everything is okay. She wants to tell him, but Richard doesn't give her time to talk and tells her everything is fine between them. Days later, Marcos meets with Kat, revealing to her photos he secretly took of Vivian coming to Richard when Kat was out of the house. They see each other many times a week. He continues by revealing Richard doesn't have an office, it's a calling service that takes his calls. He isn't even sure Richard is a psychiatrist. Kat is in complete disbelief. That night, Kat confronts Richard by showing him the photos. Richard tries to say that Vivian is her patient. He adds that she is hallucinating because of those pills. But Kat isn't buying it. She tells him she is filing for divorce, so Richard gets aggressive towards her. Fortunately, Kat grabs a knife pointing at him and he let her go. Kat calls the cops and goes to her sister's house. The next day, an old friend called Miriam, who is now a journalist, confronts her on why she left the city after Miriam was drugged that night and the whole town blamed it on Kat, thinking she was jealous, so that's why Kat left. 2 weeks later, Kat and Richard are in court for their divorce. Kat is shocked to witness Vivian by his side. Miriam is also there covering for her magazine. Richard has no lawyer and represents himself. He claims his ex-wife was jealous. He had no affair with Vivian, and Susan, Vivian's friend who died, was a patient of his. He makes the wild accusation that Kat killed Susan with the sleeping medicine she had. He even brings her past in the city with the prom incident, saying she did drug Miriam because she was getting close to the man she loved. After it, Miriam confronts her but Kat storms out. Kat then decides to take a break from work. Marcos tells her that on the night of Susan's death, Kat's car was noticed by Susan's house. Kat puts it together, and says it was the night Richard asked to borrow her car. She realizes Richard set her up, as even Marcos doubts her. That night, Vivian finds a note Richard made pretending to be Kat saying she will end everything. Richard catches up and finishes her with the sleeping pills. Later, someone knocks on Alex's house. Kat opens and it's Vivian, who collapses in front of her. Richard takes her away. Alex comes back and can't find her, so she calls Marcos. The following morning, Kat wakes up being tied up next to a lake. He wants to throw her in the lake. Kat fights back and runs away. Richard runs after her. Minutes later, Marcos arrives at the lake. And when Richard catches up to her, he shows up behind. He reveals autopsy shows Richard's DNA all over Susan's body. Richard tries to play the victim, saying it was Kat, but Marcos arrests Richard as police arrives. That night, Marcos is having dinner with Kat, Alex and Miriam. He reveals Richard wasn't even his name, he had a criminal history. Miriam apologizes. The movie ends with all four of them having dinner.